Okay, great. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining online and in person. If anybody's in the office, there are bagels up here, so you can definitely come up and enjoy our presenter in person. So I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Joe Hale, who's a colleague and collaborator. We were actually introduced through an initiative from Emory and St. Andrews for Home Institution, the Halle Institute and St. Andrews collaboration. We've been working together for years. Joe's a demographer and sociologist with interest in social disparities relating to especially to cognitive decline. She is based at the University of St. Andrews, but a lot of her work, including some of the things that she'll be talking about today, pertain to health across the lifespan at older ages in the U.S. population. So over to you, Joe.
Right. Thank you, Solveig. Yeah, so I'm very happy to be here. As I said, I will be presenting this work in progress. So we have been as Solveig said, we've been working together for a few years, and every now and again I open our folder and I was like, oh, we have one grant proposal entitled Institutionalized Frailty that I would like to get back to someday, but we're not talking about institutionalized frailty today. We're going to be talking about this project where we're studying social isolation, loneliness, and later life cognitive decline. And there's a number, you can see the number of collaborators on here in addition to Solveig and me. So Angelo Laurenti is was one of my colleagues at the Max Planck Institute, and he ran the one of the analyses I'll be presenting today. And then Shubhankar Sharma, who just successfully passed his Viva a couple weeks ago. So now he's Dr. Sharma. He is focused on one of his papers for his doctoral dissertation is on the loneliness, later life cognitive decline thing. I'm not sure. We'll see how we go time-wise. I may or may not present that today. I'm presenting it at PAA, so some of you will see it at PAA. And then Solveig, obviously, and then Mika Mershkala, who's the director of the Max Planck Institute. I've heard some people say this, but we don't always like. So this is hot off the presses sort of presentation. So any mistakes are definitely mine, because some of the collaborators haven't had a chance to see some of the actual work yet. So okay, here. Okay. So I mentioned already this is work in progress, and I love presenting work in progress because it's like at the stage where A, I'm not going to be defensive if you give me critical feedback, and B, that critical feedback can actually be put to use versus presenting something that's like already being submitted or like in publication already. So I think it's a good time to present, even if it sometimes makes you a little bit more nervous about presenting. Okay. So we're all health researchers here, right? So I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the background. All of us know that population aging means we have to be concerned about the sorts of illnesses that crop up later in life. And so the demographic processes and kind of what that means. And for this project, part of what that means is that when people have these really long life expectancies, Alzheimer's disease and related dementias become people are in higher risk ages for longer, and so it's become more problematic. And by more problematic, we're talking not small numbers here. We're talking 18 million people with some sort of cognitive impairment in the U.S. right now, with projections of something like 35 million people by 2050. Right? These are not small numbers of people. So that's an issue, and I think probably I know that you all tend to research more the other sorts of morbidities like diabetes, cardiovascular disease, and that, which are obviously also not ideal, but at least there's some sorts of sense as to things we can do preventatively or treatment-wise. Whereas for Alzheimer's disease, especially, we got nothing. We got almost nothing in terms of treatment. So there are some. There are some pharmacological interventions, but they don't do that much at this point. They're not particularly efficacious. So that's one of the things that makes that's one of the reasons that the governments all over the world are pouring a lot of money into Alzheimer's and related dementia research. Okay. It's also one of the reasons that in my work I focus on modifiable risk factors because well, I focus on sociopolitical inequalities as well, right? So I focus on race ethnicity, which, you know, not modifiable in and of themselves, but of course the types of stressors that we experience in a socially stratified racist society means those parts are modifiable. But anyways, what we're talking about today actually is social isolation and loneliness. And this figure here, I decided to have the slide, no words really. This figure here is actually both the percentage of people who are over age 65 in the US right now who live alone. So something like 30%, 33% of people live alone. And then it's also the close to approximately the percent of people who report feeling loneliness, right? So older people, age 65 plus, who report feeling loneliness. I don't want to minimize the fact that we have a lot of young people in the US who also report feeling lonely, but because of this hypothesized connection between socialization, loneliness, and health, that's obviously more of an issue at older ages when you're at risk for more health insults. Okay, so I'm here from Scotland despite my accent, and I just wanted to give you an example because it's not like a US problem, right? It's an everywhere problem. While deaths in Scotland from circulatory diseases have halved in the amount of time from 2000 to 2018, deaths from dementia and Alzheimer's have more than tripled. So I don't actually know, you guys see your face, like I don't actually know what this figure looks like in the US, but I wouldn't think it would be like that dramatically different, right? Now, one thing that people sometimes think is like, well, you gotta die of something, right? And that's true, but the actual process of Alzheimer's and related dementia is like, well, it's not a good process. Probably most of you have had some experience because the numbers are, you know, because of the prevalence being so high. So a lot of people will have had grandparents or something like that with it. So, so this is not ideal. We have to figure out what sorts of modifiable social risk factors we can actually deal with here. So in terms of theoretical framework, so basically all of my research, as I mentioned before, focuses on sociopolitical factors contributing to health inequalities. And I'm often kind of thinking about intersectionality, like how do all of these factors, you know, expose us to certain advantages and disadvantages, and then how do they do that across the life course so they might accumulate, so that we're accumulating disadvantages or accumulating advantages. I forgot to say, I'm very happy to have kind of econ style. I don't know if you talk about that this way here, but my PhD is in sociology. And we always talk about econ style versus sociology style. Sociology style, you wait until the end of the presentation to ask questions, and econ style, people often like to have a question on the first slide, like, I don't like your title. I'm happy for econ, so you don't have to wait until the end if something is confusing or you have a question, a clarifying question. And you're moderating online, right? So if somebody asks a question, will you see? Yeah, wonderful. Thank you for that. Okay, anyway, so here are my theoretical frameworks here. And in this work, what that means is kind of thinking about the sorts of exposures across the life course, but then focusing on social isolation and loneliness experience later in life. Okay, so our hypotheses here. The first hypothesis is that eliminating social isolation will be protective against cognitive decline for women and men. Now, again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail because I think the methods and the kind of results and then our future work is probably more interesting to everyone. And probably we all have a sense as to why, right? So people who are feeling isolated, who aren't getting those kind of social interactions, probably are would have a higher sort of, or a faster rate of decline or a higher risk of experiencing cognitive impairment. There's lots of work also on social networks and gender differences. So there, I would call it like a slight hypothesis that there might be a significant gender difference in the effect of social isolation on cognitive decline. And some of the reason for that is actually methodological. So it's not that I think necessarily that women's social isolation is going to be a different, like negatively impact their health differentially, but our measure of social isolation, I think you'll see in a minute when I show you what's in that measure, means that there's a lot of stuff that's not in that measure that might be different between women and men. Okay, the second hypothesis is that a portion of the effect of social isolation on cognitive function operates through loneliness. So it's not just that you're socially isolated, but that if you are socially isolated and then therefore lonely, that's taking some of the effect there, right? So I guess one way of thinking about it is that if you're socially isolated but not lonely, then that decline, that risk of cognitive impairment might not be quite as bad. I've got some pictures here. Now, so here, this is the goal and its challenges. And so the challenges in this are very much methodological. So cognitive function and social isolation are what we would call longitudinally interdependent. So you can imagine how perhaps if somebody is socially isolated, they might have, I'm positing that somebody socially isolated is going to be at higher risk of cognitive decline or cognitive impairment, but also people who are experiencing cognitive decline or cognitive impairment might socially isolate themselves, right? They might have to retire from their work, they might withdraw from their friends. Again, this is something that kind of, probably a lot of us have even seen movies or read books or something where this sort of thing happens, right? So it's something we understand happens. So that's an issue, right? Because in our traditional regression framework, anything that's longitudinally interdependent, if you have time-varying intermediate confounders, so for example, loneliness is going to be a time-varying intermediate confounder because it is affected by social isolation, affects socialization, so cognitive function is going to be working both ways there. And then with issues of reverse causality, where we have a determinant like social isolation that is going to be affected by cognitive function itself, like we talked about before. So this kind of combination makes traditional regression modeling basically unacceptable for this sort of analysis. So instead of that, we use a model that is much more common in epidemiology. So some of y'all are probably more familiar with it than my sociological comrades. And I'll talk more about that in a minute, but I want to introduce the data first. Again, probably a lot of you are familiar with the health and retirement study, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. You probably know it's biennial, so they ask people every 2 years. It's nationally representative, population-based. They oversample for Blacks and Latinx. There's all sorts of, it's a very rich data set. If you haven't used it before, I encourage you to look at it. There's things like retrospective about early childhood, all the way up through, asking people of their experiences of social isolation and loneliness. The measures of cognitive function, some obviously they're not as great as if they did sort of a neuro assessment, but they do have some nuance for those as well. And the best thing I would say about going with HRS is they've been doing it biannually for 20, well, really more than 20 years. We have about 20 years of cognitive data. So we can really track people over time and look at their rate of decline. In this particular analysis, we have people aged 50 to 100, and that leaves us with something like 30,000 individuals. Yeah.
Sorry, for the previous slide.
Yeah.
Are everybody who are socially isolated also lonely?
No, yeah, and that's one of the things, right? And that's one of the things that we're trying to get at with this is that the correlation between social isolation and loneliness is not as high as you would expect, like somewhere around 0.3, 0.4. Depending on what you're looking at. So there are certainly people who, especially when we get into what I'm using in this as my index of social isolation. It'll be even more obvious to you kind of the limitations of the study, let's say, right? So there are people in this data set who have, who we call socially isolated, who say they're lonely, and ones who say that they're not. And there's a lot of, likewise, there's a lot of lonely people who aren't isolated. Yeah, so that goes both ways for sure. Any other questions? Okay. So let's define the outcome variable first. So for cognitive function, we have measures of the measures that I use in the study are the measures that a lot of cognitive function researchers use. And they're derived from the telephone interview for cognitive status, a modified version of that. It's been modified to try and minimize ceiling effects and floor effects. So ceiling effects such that, basically, that everyone gets, everyone can get high, you can't get whatever. So I'll show you the distribution. So here you can see we don't have a situation where basically people kind of top out or people bottom out. We have something that looks like a normal distribution here. So we have immediate recall, delayed recall, serial sevens, and backward counting from 20. And this is just an example. We're not actually using this in here, but to give you a sense of what these numbers mean. So in in the Adams study, which actually did give neuropsych assessments to people who tested as doing poorly on tics, they basically established these cut points. These cut points say if you have 12 and above, then you're probably not cognitively impaired. If you have 7 to 11, then you're probably mildly impaired, so cognitive impairment, no dementia. This one is a little shadier, like there's more error in this center one. And the dementia would be people who have 0 to 6. So what that means in life, like when you think about it, is somebody who's down here in dementia, they're probably not, I would imagine that most of the people who are down here in dementia need some support in their day-to-day living, okay? So I would correlate more highly with things like activities of daily living. Okay, so that's the main outcome variable, right? A continuous measure of cognitive function. The predictor variables that we're looking at include the social isolation index and loneliness. Now, both of them, I'm just going to say up front, like both of them are problematic in their own ways. So the social isolation index is different than if you read a paper that was like specifically on social isolation and they were looking at a shorter time period and they didn't require regular kind of biennial data. So there's actually in the HRS, there's great measures for social isolation, but they're asked every 4 years and only recently. So these measures here, we have from starting in 1998, and they're asked every 2 years, and there's not a lot of missingness, and so we're rolling with it, and thinking that we've got something going on here in terms of whether or not people are isolated, right? So if people live alone, right, that's a sense of how they might be isolated. Can they use email, right? So I think probably all of us are like, I think so. This, like I said, this is part of this process is trying to figure out like to what data do we have access? What are the measures? Do we have them consistently? And can we make an argument about why this might be reflective of isolation? Yeah, okay, I'll leave that there for now. We do, yeah, I'll leave that there. So loneliness, the self-report of loneliness where they just ask a single item, I felt lonely in the last week. That is also, I don't love this measure. What I love about it is that we have it starting from 1998. So this is another measure that gets asked every 2 years. We have it from 1998. So we can really track, the diagram that I was showing you, right? So we can look at that. If you compare this to this is a much better measure, this three item measure, the UCLA loneliness scale. Unfortunately, we only have it more recently. So we will look at a subset. We haven't done this yet, but we will look at a subset using the UCLA loneliness scale. Quite a few people are more likely to show up as lonely if you look at the loneliness scale than just and as you would expect, there are gender differences in reporting. There are socioeconomic differences and racial ethnic differences in reporting when you just straight up ask people, are you lonely, right? Okay. So we have, I forget to get my timer thing. So as I said before, super rich data set, we have all sorts of factors in here. We have sociodemographic factors, we have behavioral and health factors. So back to the method. So I was explaining before about how the traditional regression framework is problematic when you have longitudinal interdependence and intermediate confounding. Happily, the causal inference framework of the G formula can handle that. So this DAG here, the first step in the G formula is to create a DAG. And the DAG here, all we're saying here is that, and it's exactly what you would think. Like the thing that I love about G formula is it might look a little complicated, it might feel a little complicated. I confess I called it the magic formula for a number of years, which people did not like, but it's exactly what we know about how the life course works, right? Like, so here's cognitive function. Your cognitive function at time point 1 or age 50 is gonna affect your cognitive function at the next age, right? That makes sense, yeah? Which is gonna affect the one before that and the one after the one after. It's also going to affect any mediating factors like loneliness, right? So you can see, so that's why it gets like all of these arrows getting complicated. So we have the mediating factors, which are going to affect each other at time 2, at time 3, et cetera. And then we have our main sort of intervention variable here, which in the analysis I'll be showing you is social isolation. And then we have any number of other time varying confounders like comorbidities and that kind of thing. So what we do is we're looking at that. All the way from age 50, the starting point, to age 100, which is when we kind of we cut off. Okay, So the rest of the process, so that's step one. Step two is we estimate a series of multivariable models for each time varying model. So basically it's just a ton of what you already know how to do. I mean, some of you have, raise your hand if you've used G formula before. Does anyone? I meant to ask at the beginning. Okay. So I'll keep going and give more info then. So you're just running a bunch of models where you're allowing all the time varying variables to function simultaneously as exposures, intermediate confounders, and outcomes. Of course, you're also modeling the time invariant variables, but they're not changing because of time invariant. Then you define the hypothetical intervention. So Shub's work focuses on loneliness. Our work looks at both isolation and loneliness. So I put them both in there, but they're in two different papers right now. Then you produce a natural course scenario. So the natural course scenario is just an approximation of the empirical data in the HRS. And then what you're going to do is you're going to mess with it. Let's put it in late terms. You're going to mess with it. You're going to intervene, and you're going to say, what happens if we said, like what we've done right now is what happens if these people weren't isolated? What happens if they weren't lonely? Then what would their cognitive function look like? And the benefit of that, if we're looking at, let's say, Joe, we're saying, okay, Joe at age 60, you know, she's got her natural course. Like this has been her life course. Like she's a white lady, you know, she's got, you know, X education and Y occupation. And this is what her cognitive function looks at age 60, right? And then we're going to say, what if we just change this one thing? We're going to change one thing, and that's going to be that she's not isolated anymore. She says she's isolated and now she's not. Or she says she's lonely and now she's not. Then what happens to her cognitive function? So I'm comparing me to me. And that's what makes it a different sort of model than the regression model where I'm comparing me to you, right? So then the effect estimate, so then what we get are basically two main outcomes that I'll be talking about today. So the population averaged effect. And what that, so I think from a population health perspective, the PAEs were helpful because we say, all right, what would happen in Atlanta if we eliminated social isolation, right? Then we would say, what is the benefit to cognitive function in Atlanta if we eliminated social isolation, even though we don't know how many people in Atlanta are actually isolated, right? So we have a denominator that's all of Atlanta, which kind of dilutes the effect estimate. But that's how population health interventions work, right? Now, in contrast, the average treatment on the treated is what would happen if we could identify all the people in Atlanta who were isolated and we made them not isolated. So then you get that, let's say, the true effect on the individual. So we took the 60-year-old Joe and we said, you're no longer isolated. Then what's the effect for me? And that matters too, right? Okay. All right, so I kind of talked through this already. So we have this natural course scenario where we're like, okay, here are all these factors over the life course that we know are associated with cognitive function. And we're gonna mess with this red one, this social isolation, and see what happens. So we're gonna compare this natural course with this intervention scenario. And we're gonna get some results. Okay. I think I'll skip this in the interest of time. But if anybody wants to come and watch it at PAA, then watch it at PAA, or read if there's time at the end, we can talk about it. Okay, so this is the focus on social isolation one. So our hypothesis one, as you may remember, I assume you're listening very closely, is that eliminating social isolation would be protective against cognitive decline, right? And we do find that it is. So so this is the population average effect. So the one that I was saying, if we just said we're gonna implement this change across Atlanta, which is gonna scoop up people who are isolated and people who are not isolated. So what we're looking at here is, you know, along the horizontal axis, of course, we have age, and we have for men and panel for women. This is the population average effect. So basically, I think the basics of it is anything over 0 means that we have a protective effect against cognitive decline, right? So we're looking at cognitive decline across time. So if we take somebody 55 and say, all right, you are no longer isolated, then we see like a 10% boost in their cognitive function is basically what's happening there. So anything here is a positive. The effect estimates for this, I find kind of like, they look small, right? They look small, but when you think about how cognitive decline is measured in this data, it's at what we're actually looking at here is a 30% decrease in rate of decline. So it's actually quite large, when you think about how that works. So we have this, does anybody have any questions about this for now, what that means? So we think, Angelo and I think that the fact that we no longer see a benefit in these upper ages is probably not that surprising, right? So there's only so much, in some ways, like there's only so much we can do by intervening on social isolation once you get up in these super high risk ages. So that's our hypothesis for why it looks like this. We have another paper, raised G formula, where we looked at intervening on retirement, and we cut that age a little bit earlier, but we didn't see this kind of crossing over the line in that one. Yeah, Sheila.
So how many people do you have over the age of 90? Just wondering if it's sort of like an obstacle, like you actually have data in that space.
We do have data in that space. Of course, the confidence intervals, grow.
Sure. I mean, data. But...
Yeah. But we do have, I think, so really, so I'm glad you asked that. More of the problem is I think, or we think, is this. Look at this here. So first of all, these cohorts who are over age 90 using email, I don't know how many of you have like grandparents or something like that, right? Like, so that's a thing. But also these sorts of things, like there aren't that many 90-year-olds who are going to be taken care of. Their grandkids and all. So the social isolation index means that most people over 90 are isolated, which means when we do an intervention, we're not sure how. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I don't think I said that correctly. I think it's the other way around, is that we would have thought that, but I think the senescence thing is an issue. So one question that we might have would be like, is it useful to look at those really upper ages? Like I think Shub actually cut his at 80. Like he's like, okay, so up to age 80, something, but we kind of wanted to see what it looked like. So actually Angelo did do the analysis looking just at 50 to 80, and it is, as you would expect, like there's more of an effect if you're only looking at those ages, just like what you can see when you check it. So
for some of those items, like hearing problems, if they have hearing problems, but they also have a hearing device.
Yes.
How is that?
Yeah, how is that reflected? So I think this is something I've been thinking quite a bit about, and it's complicated, isn't it? Because so, for example, probably a lot of us know people who have hearing problems, who have hearing aids, but who don't wear them, right? So I think, so what we have in the data is whether or not people have hearing problems and whether or not they have hearing aids, but we don't know what their actual use of the hearing aid is. So it would be interesting to explore further. And actually one of my former colleagues at Max Planck is exploring hearing in more detail. So it might be that we get more more nuance on that, but that's a good question. I did wonder about that too. Yeah.
Also for cannot use email, does that group in social media as well?
It doesn't, no. So this is one of those kind of older, because the survey was born in the early 90s when social media wasn't a thing. I think so when we use the UCLA loneliness scale that I was saying I think is much better, then well, there's two main issues. So one is we have a much more restricted rate ages of where we can look at decline, right? So we'll only be able to look at 10 years instead of 20 years. And then the other is around the gap, right? So if we only know that every 4 years, right? So anything that's in these modules that they only give like the leave behind questionnaire, that's what I'm talking about. So leave behind questionnaire is only every 4 years. And so then we would be like, okay, so they answer this in 2015 or 16, I guess. And then we don't get their cognitive function until 4 years later. I don't know how defensible it is for us to argue that something happened in 2016 affects cognitive. Yeah, anyways, but it's a good question. And I don't know if HRS, does anybody in here know this, has HRS adapted to include things like social media use? I bet they will. I bet that will be something that gets included in part because in the COVID environment, a lot of older people did learn how to use social media to stay in touch and Zoom and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Though social media has been shown to correlate perhaps positively with social isolation rather than negatively.
Rather than decrease it, yeah.
But my question was again thinking about the older adults. When I think about a lot of other components of health,
Yeah.
There's some discussion that people who make it to very old ages are different,
Yeah.
sort of all along, perhaps even, than people who die earlier. So people who die at 100 may look different in terms of many health components, even at age 70 compared with. So I was wondering what are the patterns at the oldest ages for cognitive decline? Is this also a thing for cognitive decline as well as for some of the physical things? And maybe related to that, maybe you have already a descriptive table. I'm just curious, like what proportion of people have loneliness, isolation, and cognitive decline as you put all this together?
Yeah, I just realized I put the descriptive table in the PA thing, but I forgot to put it in here. But yes, I do of course have a descriptives on that. To answer your first question, the benefit of doing the longitudinal modeling and doing it within the causal inference framework is that we are comparing you to you. So everything that you have that made you live till you were 90, that made you, super grand or whatever, you still have, you're just no longer isolated. So I think that's, to me, that's like the power of this particular framework. I think you're right. I think, there's a lot more sensitivity, this is like, I literally got the stuff on route for years. So there's lots and lots of sensitivity analyses that we would need to do, including like the effect of nutrition and all that. But I think all of that is, that we would usually worry more about if we were doing cross-sectional analysis or even doing this in a traditional regression framework, I think is less problematic in this particular framework. Any other questions?
Kind of, leveraging on that, looking at the strips by age group, that would be interesting. I was just, like, some of the other items, doesn't have grandchildren or doesn't care for grandchildren. If you're 90, you probably had a child
who's also a grandparent now.
So,
Yeah, totally, yeah.
So, like, some of those, they're not age specific for the group, so they may be more true for the 60 to 80. But then it's like, it's not that they don't have people coming and visit, because the way it's framed is like, do you actively help?
Yes,
And how often, like, if I have grandparents or older parents, am I gonna go out of my way and ask my 100-year-old grandmother to help me do something?
Totally,
Even if she's cognitively able to.
Yes, 100%. I mean, one of the things that I'm sure you're all researchers. I'm sure you know how many different ways I constructed this social isolation index and how many different things we thought about with it. And one of the, in fact, just like a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that we were contemplating was only looking. So this other paper that I mentioned, we focused on labor force participation and the idea that not that it's like getting a paycheck. That is like intuitive against cognitive decline, but that there's something about like getting out of the house and having a schedule and working and interacting with people or something like that, right? Or even if you're not getting out of the house, like a lot of us aren't all the time getting out of the house. But anyways, so we were arguing that it's more about cognitive engagement, right? So we did think, well, maybe for this paper, we should just look at these three, basically like a substitution effect. So, okay, so maybe you retired, but you're still volunteering, or you are taking care of your grandkids or whatever, right? So we thought about clustering it that way and not calling it social isolation, right? Because I think the social isolation index needs more in it than just that you're, volunteering or something like that. So I think for now, I am very interested in this idea of social isolation. I think the big question is like, what do we have that we can actually measure it credibly? And so these are some of the things that we have that we can measure it credibly. I think there's a little bit more in there, but almost all of them are challenged in some way, let's say. So it's good feedback to hear all of this, which is basically what's been playing in my head for however long since we started the paper. And I think my guess is that we'll need to do a little bit more brainstorming about what we can do, because I'm feeling that you're not convinced. And so thinking about like what we can do to convince you, like what could be in there that would be convincing. The other thing that is I don't know. Yeah, I was gonna say this may be possible. We have this 4-year gap thing, which is a problem, right? Because I think the other, like the leave behind questionnaire has all these other measures. So anyways, yeah, okay. Eliminating social isolation is not, I think I didn't say this, is not more protective. Like, you see the same pattern here for men and women, right? Basically, we're not seeing any gender differences. At least, you know, with the measures that we have. Definitely.
I was just curious, because when you compare the two graphs, for the men, the peak effort starts around like late 50 years old to 60. While for women, you would see like
A little
it's
flatter.
maybe 70 to 80 years old. Is there a reason?
I mean, so I think because the confidence intervals are pretty well overlapping, I don't think I could make much of it. Like, I would say this looks pretty consistent to me. Yeah. I agree with you. There's a small difference in the pattern, of course, but I think that with the confidence intervals being what they are, I think we can't hang our hats on any of that. So this is the, so remember I said we've got the population average effect, which is like we're gonna implement some sort of public health intervention all the way in Atlanta. This one is, okay, we're just gonna take the socially isolated people and make them not isolated, and this is the benefit to them. So you would almost, I can't think of a time, if it's even possible, where you would not expect the ATT to be greater than the PAE, right? Because you're actually taking someone and saying, well, I guess it would happen if there was no difference, right? If there was no significant difference, then the PAE and ATT would be the same. But anyways, but we do see a difference here. You can see, even though there wasn't space to have them side by side on the same graph, like, it's not hugely different, but there is. And the reason it's not hugely different is because so many people were isolated, right? So many people at some point in their lives are isolated, that the denominator for all of Atlanta versus the denominator for just the isolated people is not that different. So this population effect is, at ATT are closer to each other than in our labor force participation paper, because in our labor force participation paper, we looked at postponing, and that the number of people then is the difference between the denominator is greater for the retirement paper than for this. Does that be following? Yeah. So the denominator is actually pretty similar for the PAE, the population average effect, and the average treatment on the treated. So the actual difference is not that large, which, like, if you were a public health person, you'd be like, all right, well, if this is what I see, if I see the PAE looking like this and I see the ATT looking like this is something we should just implement in all of Atlanta, right? We don't need to go through the cost of trying to identify the socially isolated people, because enough people are isolated that like a blanket intervention would be helpful. Does that make sense? It's really helpful for like this kind of modeling, I think, is really helpful. Let's see. Okay, same here, like, not, you know, like as you'll know, like there are some small differences between men and women, but they're relatively small and probably you couldn't say that much about them. Okay, the hypothesis that a portion of the effect of social isolation on cognitive function operates through loneliness, we did not find. So there, we don't see anything significant going on right now, at least with the loneliness measure that is a binary report. Lonely. Okay, so take homes. So from Shoup's paper is the thing focused on loneliness, and from our paper on social isolation, we can see that reducing loneliness or social isolation is insulative against cognitive decline. But we need further research with more nuanced measures, like what we've been talking about. Does day mean someone's coming or leaving, or that they had to chat?
Just came in.
But no chats. Yeah. Okay. Happily, there are a few other data sets that we can consider that have social isolation and loneliness measures. Okay. Are we doing that? We're doing fine. Does anyone have any, before I move on to the exciting next things, does anybody have any? Yeah.
I guess, so I'm in an FE class this semester and I've been learning about counterfactuals.
Yeah.
So it's my first time hearing about the G formula, and I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the advantages of that versus like a cohort or like a matched study design.
A matched study design. So I would say that the biggest advantage, so this is the counterfactual framework, right? So G formula is just one of the many options of counterfactuals. I think that the main thing is, and I haven't done it, so I should like clarify, I have not done a matched design myself. I have used like inverse probability of treatment weights and things like that. And in that, there's always a gap, right? Because you're trying to find people who are like, but there's so much that we just don't know about people, right? I assume that's what you mean. If I'm speaking out of turn, then my mistake. But like, So instead of trying to find my match, I'm just me, right? So it's me with this and then me with this other thing. So I think to me that would be the main benefit. Does anyone else want to? Charlie, you said that you.
Well, so I could say a couple of things. One thing is matching is usually done at the design stage versus this method, which is usually done, but can be applied at the analysis stage. And then I think that there are certain kinds of, I mean, for many reasons, we can't control for certain kinds of selection bias in matching usually, like that's one of the big concerns, whereas supposedly like the G formulas, everything.
Yeah. That help? Yeah. I mean, I'm a big fan. Are you a PhD student?
No, I'm not.
I'm a PhD student. So like, I have thought of myself, like, I love learning about new models. So I think it makes sense to read about all the models. So the person who I first learned about counterfactual modeling was Tyler Vandervelde. Have you read any of his work? He's amazing. I love him. He's an amazing teacher as well, which you don't always expect. Like not all, brilliant statisticians from Harvard are amazing teachers, let's be honest, but he is. So if you ever see he's giving a class or something, he's just like extremely down to earth and very clear. But he's published a bunch of papers on like, he's an epidemiologist, like a bunch of papers on this sort of thing. Might be worth looking him up. Okay, all right. So Solvik and I have been working on this social isolation loneliness stuff, like really interested in what's going on with that. We have not been resting on our laurels. We have also kind of used this Halle funding as a launching pad to write a much bigger grant. And this grant involves a bunch of people here as well. So this grant, we're talking about integrating trajectories of cognitive decline and cardiometabolic health in the US. So probably everybody knows that poor cardiometabolic health, is associated with poor cognitive health, right? So we're interested in thinking about those sorts of questions. And here's a nice figure that Jackie made for us. I'm starting in here. Okay, so there's 3 aims for this project. The first aim is to harmonize, pool, and bridge 6 national data sets to measure cognitive trajectories from age 50. And the idea of this basically is that cardiometabolic health poor cardiometabolic health often happens earlier in the life course than the poor cognitive health that might follow it. So if we're looking at data sets that include younger people, we can basically borrow from the younger data sets as predictors. We're like, okay, so how long have you had diabetes? How long have you had, cardiovascular disease or whatever prior to experiencing this rate of cognitive decline? So we're putting together all these data sets. There we go. And then we can estimate these integrated trajectories of cognitive decline and the cardiometabolic conditions. And then, of course, as always, like these things are not experienced equally across the population. So we want to understand this kind of process and how it unfolds unequally by race, ethnicity, and gender, socioeconomic status, and geography, which I guess all of y'all are health researchers. You understand like what those patterns look like in the US. So these are the data that are in here, and this group, not me, but some of the members of this group that I showed on the previous slide have already been working with a number of these data sets to harmonize them to look at obesity specifically. Is that right? To look specifically at obesity in earlier life. So basically, all we're doing is using what they've developed, like the tools they've developed to merge those data sets to look at earlier life to now look at later life. So you can see we have a number of different ages represented, starting points, baselines, quite a hefty sample once you combine them all. And then happily, we also have a number of cognitive function measures in all of the data sets. So the good thing is that we have some pretty solid indicators of cognitive function, even at earlier life. So one of the reasons to be interested in these earlier years and and not to start measuring cognitive function at 65 is what I was talking about before about pharmacological interventions. So there is a strong hypothesis, let's call it, that the brain deterioration has happened before we start picking up on symptoms. And that the pharmacological interventions are going to be more efficacious if we can administer them earlier in the life course. And so if we can get a sense of what's going on earlier in the life course, we might have better luck, is the idea. Not just for pharmacological intervention, but any kind of intervention. So we've got some kind of standard measures across all of them, and then we've got some sort of enhanced measures in some of the more recently developed surveys. And the idea is to kind of like borrow the strengths from all of the surveys to get a better sense of what's going on for people. But for now, we are waiting because we have to wait for them to read the grant and tell us how wonderful we are. But we're not only waiting. I used some of sort of that thought pattern about the benefits of sort of putting data sets together, and right this very moment, we are writing a grant due right this very moment. That is a proof of concept working with an evolutionary biologist to use mathematical tools that he developed to identify modifiable risk factors for cognitive decline. So his original brain model is about the development of the brain, right? So it's this is from a paper that he published in 2018. I put that there. And be cool. Like, oh, do that. Okay. So Mauricio developed and a colleague wrote this early a few years ago, and it's the idea here is basically like we can track all this stuff. We can look at data and develop a brain model that helps us understand brain development. But what he did was he just looked at Bolivian data from an anthropologist, the acquisition of skills, and you can see he just kind of like his model kind of just flattens at age 20. They're like, okay, you got everything you're going to get by age 20, and then we're just going to ignore, from then on, you just kind of flatline, which of course we know is not how it happens, right? Because what's out the other end is this, right? Some sort of decline happening, not for everyone, but for most, yeah. So we're going to try and adapt this brain model to yield predictions that are kind of coming out this end. So what's happening here in these three panels is he's using the body mass and brain mass, and then the other one is metabolism, skill level. And so you can see here, so the dots are the actual data, and the line is a model of the data. Okay, so that's what's going on there. And then this is kind of similar, which is why I put it together in my head, to the G formula that I was just talking about, in that if you mess with, my lay terms, if you mess with anything here, it's basically a counterfactual, right? So here we're saying, if the environment, let's look at this one here, if the environment is more challenging during childhood, then what's your skill level at age 40? So that's what his model currently does. And he can find, or he can say, okay, so actually the environment in early life is like more challenging or whatever, then the skill level is not so good at age 40. But if the environment is challenging at age 9, then actually the skill level increases. So you can imagine from like an intervention sort of public health framework, this might be a really interesting model to try and adapt, right? So again, this is a proof of concept. It's a goal. So we'll see how it goes. But I think that there's some real potential there to combine them, and especially to kind of work with these harmonized data sets that a lot of Emory folk have been doing. And because he's got this Bolivian anthropological data on hunter-gatherers, right? And so I think the question is okay, so what can we do with the data that we have right now? So he's super excited about the types of data we use, because he's like, it's not his world, right? So it's a truly interdisciplinary project, and it's been fun to try and learn how to speak each other's language. They're different languages, aren't they? And that's all I got. And then less time for comments, only a little bit of time for comments and questions, because we kind of did it along the way. So there's not that much time, but. Are there any questions?
I guess you just can't let go of that social isolation measure.
Yeah.
So is it, I wanted to ask, is it something that, is this a predefined by HRS/other people social isolation? Or is it something that?
It's a
that
Joe
you're-
special.
It's a Joe special.
It's a Joe
okay.
special, yeah, no, and that's why, like, I mean, like I said, like, we've modified it lots of different ways. Like, I mean, I actually had urinary incontinence in there at one point, and then I was like, oh, I don't know, that might be too. You don't know, right, like, but basically, there is a self-reported measure of isolation. But I think the literature, like the literature that I was engaging with, when I started working on the project was, basically arguing, so there's loneliness, which is your subjective experience of a gap between sort of what you have and what you want. And then there's social isolation, which is meant to be objective. Of course, other data sets have lots more kind of like social network information. But I think we can get something out of the HRS on this. I think we just need to think through, like brainstorm what's missing and what we can add. So we have things like number of living children, but we don't have, do they talk to you? Right? So yeah, so I think it's all kind of.
Yeah, we also have depression, so some of the items from the depression scale may fit into it. I wanted to ask you why you have depression and the behavioral health.
So that's a good question. So why did I have, you mean the slide with the covariates? Why was it on the, because it was on that, like the health side? Because that was like, something, to me, depression is mental health. Is that what you mean?
Well, it was classified as behavioral health.
No, it's behavior/health.
Oh,
Sorry, maybe
okay,
this
got
slide was unclear. Yeah, so behaviors like exercise, but also health like comorbidities.
Yeah.
Yeah. So depression is actually not in the model. So depression is in Shub's model because he's got a measure of loneliness and a measure of, and then depression from the CESD. But it's not in ours because the CESD, that's where that variable comes from. Right? Does it make sense? Yeah. So because lonely is actually in it. So we can't actually have depression in our.
Depression works better than loneliness since you didn't find loneliness to be a mediator. I mean, it was like, to me, the implications of it are like maybe we overestimate the psychosocial component of social isolation, and there's also some like physical deterioration, like physical stimulus or something like that. I mean, there's also a huge gap between like perception and reality and all that. And oftentimes, like I think the literature goes the other way around too, like your perception of your state is a better predictor than like what kind of neighborhood you live in or so I found, anyways, I just found it to be interesting. So
yeah, I mean, I think that the just to answer the last part first, or speak to the last part first, there is research suggesting that the interventions that we, the governments, whatever the communities are doing around loneliness are not particularly efficacious, in part because you're dealing with perception, and actually so at least some especially in the psych literature is suggesting that actually like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is going to be a better a more efficacious intervention for loneliness than like, you know, having someone come visit you once a week, because it's your perception. Does that make sense?
Interesting, okay.
So but I think the main thing
you're finding it's not your perception, right?
what's up?
But didn't you find it's not your perception?
So we find
very specific outcomes, specific data sets, so I understand you're not.
Yeah. So what we found is that this, like what we're calling an objective, of course, it's like only semi-objective, but your self-report of your engagement with others, like around helping, volunteering, grandkid care, whatever, we find a significant impact if we get rid of that. Like if we eliminate your objective social isolation, there is an insulative effect against cognitive decline. What we don't find is that operates through loneliness. Now, Shub, on the other hand, right, so for his work, where he also uses the G formula as well present in PAA, he finds that a fifth, so like 20% of the effect of loneliness on cognitive function operates through depression. So he focuses more on kind of like a different angle. So it kind of gets at yours. I think an issue with the depression thing is because so because the CESD includes like isolation and loneliness, like we haven't quite figured out how to like we either blow up the CESD completely and look at each of them as individual, which is kind of how we've done it, or you can do it like what Shub has done.
And I guess I'm sorry, I missed the first 30 minutes. So did Shub do this same study in the same data set, not the same study, but use the same data set?
Use the same data.
Okay, so depressions are, you already have that question.
Yeah, you didn't miss it. So I'm presenting this at PAA, so I was like, well, I'll just skip it in the interest of time so we can focus on, I wanted to talk about this grant and like the future work.
Yeah,
So yeah, I didn't talk about tube steps. You know, I said, yeah.
I'm curious, I think you mentioned about at some point, like how maybe some of the people who are healthier or not experiencing cognitive decline might just be like be different in some certain way. And I guess also thinking about how like with mental health, like people who experience mental illness at a young age that goes untreated are more likely to have trouble with it in their older life. Is that kind of comparable to like what you're thinking of? Like, are there factors that would be experienced like as a younger person that could maybe be acted upon, or is there something else?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think you're touching on something that we haven't spoken about. So I think the benefit of the causal inference modeling is that anything that's special about Solvig is controlled for, in that we're looking at Solvig who's isolated versus Solvig who's not isolated. So anything that happened across her whole life course that brought her to Solvig at age X is still in there. Yeah. The bit that I think you're getting at, which is a very important point, is if Solvig, and I think connects, if Solvig, sorry, I won't use it anymore, but like if this person, this older person, let's say age 70, and just to use your example, let's say the 70-year-old has had a lifetime of struggles with mental health. Is the Atlanta area like public health intervention to reduce social isolation going to help that person? You know what I mean? So like we're manipulating in here. We're saying, okay, we're going to make you not isolated, but it obscures the fact that we can't just say you shall not be isolated, right? So I think your point is really good, right? So like from an actual practical perspective, we need to think through kind of the what happens after this. Okay, so now we see if we eliminate social isolation, then we can expect kind of a population health effect is positive. But how do we actually get from point A to point B? Is I think like so then all of the stuff that's different about us across our life courses matters more than just with this like numbers stuff. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Someone has their hand raised. Do they have a question?
Hi, this is Lisa. I have a question. This is such a fascinating area of research. Thanks for the presentation. I was just wondering if you looked at your modeling or your results by urban as a factor, urban versus rural kind of thing.
Yeah, no, we didn't. I think that's a really so this is actually, so the birth of this social isolation loneliness work is actually from me being in Scotland and really thinking about how isolated people are who live rurally there, because the bus net, like I lived in this tiny village and like there was a bus at 5 p.m. and then if you missed that, the next bus wasn't until 11 p.m. These sorts of like, and that's a country with public transit options. So I think that's a really important question to think about those sorts of differences. Of course, like the loneliness side of it, I think, it's anyone's guess in some ways whether or not there are more people who live in cities who are lonely than rurally who are lonely, because there's different sorts of kind of communities and the sort of anonymity that can happen in cities and all that. So I shouldn't say it's anyone's guess. I'm sure somebody's done research on that. I don't actually know what those numbers are. So I think that's a good question about rural versus urban that we could definitely divide. So for example, we could split the model and look at rural versus urban and see if there's any difference, just in the same way that we did gender, and see what comes up. Thank you for that.
Yeah, that would be really neat. Thanks.
For the grant, what was the rationale to start 50 and not earlier?
We only have cognitive data for the most part. We have valid cognitive data starting at age 50. Yeah. Although for the grant with Mauricio, we're looking at cognitive ability, like the growth of the development of cognitive ability. So we can look at like, I think ECLS, BCLSK, right? Yeah. And in some of those earlier studies. Anything else? I think we're over. We're gonna be over time, so we should just call it. Right? Thanks everyone. Thanks for people being online. Thank you.